My name is Aurel Sterling. I'm 35 years old, a field insurance investigator in Hartford, and a single mother to my 7-year-old son, Leo. I spend my days dissecting the wreckage of other people's lives, looking for the one hidden detail that proves a lie. I never thought the most fraudulent claim I'd ever encounter would be my own family's love. Mom got kicked out on Christmas night after I let a stranger stay. Then he stared at our family photo and asked, "He was David _____, wasn't he?" A name only we knew. He pulled out a badge and a signed letter from my dad, a living witness to what Mom had hidden for years. But before the truth could set me free, I had to understand what it felt like to be abandoned in the cold by the people who shared my blood. It started at 4:02 p.m. on Christmas Eve. The Connecticut sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy with a swang mouille that made the air feel like needles against the skin. I was pulling up to the iron gates of the Sterling estate in Old Saybrook, the engine of my sedan humming a steady rhythm that usually calmed me. Leo was in the back, his forehead pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the window as he watched for the first sight of the mansion's lights. Then, the world tilted. A black Escalade, my mother's car, swerved from the driveway. It didn't slow down. I saw the metallic glint of the grille for a split second before it clipped my rear bumper, spinning my car into a frozen snowbank. The jolt was violent. I heard the snap of my own neck muscles before I felt the fire of the whiplash. The smell of burnt rubber and hot antifreeze filled the cabin, thick and suffocating. I gasped, my hand flying to my neck, my vision swimming in gray spots. In the back seat, Leo was screaming, a high, thin sound that made my heart hammer against my ribs. The door of the Escalade opened. My mother's personal driver, a man I've known for a decade, stepped out. He didn't run to us. He didn't ask if we were breathing. He walked to my driver's side door with a clinical indifference that chilled me more than the wind. He reached through the open window and took my spare key from the center console. "Madam needs your car, Aurelie," he said, his voice flat. "Hers has a transmission fault, and the director of the investment fund is arriving in 20 minutes. You understand?" He didn't wait for a response. He walked back, climbed into my car, and drove away, leaving us sitting in the slush. I sat there, the copper taste of blood in my mouth, watching the red taillights of my own vehicle disappear behind the gates of my mother's home. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling so hard I nearly dropped it. A hot trail of blood was sliding down my collar. I called Zenobia, my mother. I could hear the distant, joyous clinking of crystal and the smooth croon of Bing Crosby in the background. It sounded like a world I had never been invited to. "Mom?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice from cracking. "There was an accident. The driver took my car. Leo is sick. He has a fever, and I think I have whiplash. Please, just send the driver back to take Leo to the clinic. I just need 2 hours." Her voice came back like a chilled martini, smooth, expensive, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Aurelie, don't be dramatic. It was a fender bender. I have 30 guests arriving, and your sister Thalassa worked so hard on the seating chart. If you come in here looking like a victim, you'll ruin the optics of the evening. Catch an Uber, dear. Don't make your lack of planning my emergency." The line went dead. I looked at the screen. A notification pinged from the family group chat. Thalassa had posted a photo of a gold-rimmed plate and a hand-calligraphed name card. Underneath, she typed, "Some people will do anything to get out of the $2,000 catering contribution. Hope the injury is worth the attention, sis." I felt a strange, hollow silence settle in my chest. I've always believed that if I worked harder, gave more, and stayed silent, I would eventually earn a seat at that table. But standing in the snow, watching my blood drip onto the white powder, I realized that you cannot negotiate with people who view your survival as a nuisance. I didn't call again. I didn't beg. I opened my banking app, my thumb hovering over the Sterling Estate Fund. I saw the $2,000 pending transfer, my contribution for a party I wasn't even meant to enjoy. I clicked cancel. One luxury sedan had turned me into a stranger in the house I was still paying for. An Uber pulled up 10 minutes later. The driver, an older man named Joe with kind, tired eyes, helped me into the back seat. He saw the rag I was holding to my neck, and he saw Leo shivering against me. He looked at the mansion, then back at me. "I saw that car leave you here, ma'am," he whispered. "Is that your family?" "No," I said, and for the first time in 35 years, it didn't feel like a lie. "It's just a house." The emergency room was a blur of fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial cleaner. I sat in a plastic chair for 4 hours, holding Leo, my neck stiffening into a permanent ache. I didn't cry. I sat there and watched the clock. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was an investigator collecting receipts. I noted the time of the crash, the driver's words, and the digital trail of my sister's mockery. We returned to the estate at 10 p.m. I had 8 stitches, a neck brace, and a prescription for Leo that I had to fill at a 24-hour pharmacy. I walked toward the side entrance, the one they made me use so I wouldn't disturb the aesthetic. I slid my key into the lock. It didn't turn. I tried again, my heart sinking. The deadbolt had been replaced. I stood there in the dark, the wind howling through the trees, realized I had been erased from my own history. I turned toward the garden shed, the only place I knew that might still be open, and that's when I saw him. A man stood beside the barn, his body covered in frost and salt, looking as if he had just emerged from the very fog. He didn't look at me. He was staring at the upstairs window, at the flickering light of the library, where the portrait of my father, Cyprian, hung above the fireplace. He looked at me, his eyes piercing through the dark, and whispered a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in 20 years. "That's him, isn't it? Cyprian David. I've been looking for his blood for a long time." That stranger was the only person who actually saw me that Christmas. I had no idea that the man my mother called a failure had left behind a truth that could burn down the entire Sterling family fortune. Now, let me take you back to the winter of 2014 in Hartford, Connecticut. It was the year the snow never seemed to melt, a relentless, blinding white that blanketed the city in a deceptive peace. It was also the year my father, Cyprian Sterling, was officially declared a memory after his car supposedly veered off a bridge into the icy depths of the Connecticut River. In our house, love wasn't a feeling. It was a performance review. Zenobia, my mother, was the architect of this system. She wore her mourning black like a designer brand, turning her grief into a social currency that bought her the pity of the entire tri-state area. Then there was Thalassa, my older sister, the golden child, the shining star around whom our small, cold universe orbited. And finally, there was Cyprian, the shadow who provided for us all until he became a ghost. Zenobia taught us the hierarchy early. Thalassa was the investment. I was the insurance policy. Thalassa was porcelain, fragile, beautiful, and meant to be displayed in the softest light. I was gravel, rough, unremarkable, but the only thing you could actually build a foundation on. She was celebrated for her potential, for the person she might one day become if the world was kind enough. I was managed for my utility, the silent engine that kept the lights on and the pantry full. Zenobia's eyes would ignite with a predatory warmth the moment Thalassa walked into a room, her voice softening into a coo. When I entered, she simply checked the gold watch on her wrist to see if I was late with the dry cleaning or the bank deposits. I remember the day I received my license as a field insurance investigator. I had finished at the top of my class, fueled by a desperate need to understand the mechanics of truth and risk. I brought the certificate home, placing it on the mahogany tea table, waiting for a single word of recognition. Zenobia didn't even look up from her Earl Grey. She brushed the parchment aside as if it were a common circular. "That's nice, Aurelie," she said, her voice flat and distant. "Now go help Thalassa with her luggage. She's going to Paris for the spring to find herself. She's much too delicate to carry those heavy trunks alone. No celebratory dinner, no photo for the mantelpiece. Just another task added to the ledger of my life." I picked up the bags, the weight of them straining my shoulders, and I didn't say a word. I told myself it made sense. Thalassa was the one who needed the world to be soft. I was the strong one. I could handle the weight. Months later, at my father's memorial service, the pattern solidified into a cage. The church was filled with the scent of expensive lilies and the muffled sobs of Hartford's elite. Thalassa gave a performance that would have won an Oscar, weeping so violently she had to be carried out of the sanctuary by two pallbearers. I was the one who stayed behind to handle the coroner's report, the funeral director's fees, and the freezing bureaucracy of the probate court. As I stood by the casket, dry-eyed and calculating the final expenses, I overheard Zenobia whispering to a family friend in the foyer. "Aurelie is so cold," she sighed, dabbing a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "She has no heart, no depth of feeling. She's just like her father, utilitarian. Thank God I have Thalassa. Her soul is so much more attuned to the tragedy." I felt a familiar sharp pain under my ribs, but I ignored it. I told myself, Mother is grieving. She didn't mean it. Thalassa is very sensitive, and there needs to be an adult here. I believed that my strength lay in my identity, the badge of honor that set me apart. At that moment, I didn't realize that I wasn't being celebrated for my resilience. I was being exploited. A person once said that the greatest burden a child can bear is the unlived life of their parents. In our house, the burden was much heavier. I was the one expected to live the life that made their comfort possible, to be the hands that worked so their hands could stay clean. I was the silent partner in a contract I never signed. I told myself my father left me nothing but a relentless work ethic so that his widow and eldest daughter could live in peace. I accepted the role of the provider, the one who fixed the leaks and balanced the checkbooks, thinking that one day the ranking would change. But I was blind to the mechanical reality of our home. The favoritism wasn't just emotional. It was financial. There was a black hole in our family's history where my father's legacy should have been, and I was about to find out exactly how much it was going to cost me to keep it from collapsing. Early this past December, weeks before the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, the frost in our house seemed to break. It started with a morning text from Zenobia. "Thinking of you and Leo. Found a vintage watch catalog today. Reminded me so much of your father. Dinner Sunday?" I know that now. Back then, I thought the years of being the unseen daughter were finally ending. I thought I had finally reached a level of professional success that forced them to see me not as a utility, but as a person. I was 35, a top investigator, and for the first time, my mother was asking about my world. Dinner at the estate was unusually warm. The smell of cedar and expensive candles filled the dining room, and Thalassa was tucked into her chair, leaning toward me with a soft, practiced interest. They didn't talk about their latest galas or the boutique's expansion. Instead, they asked about my job. "How is the new contract with the Hartford firm Aurel? Is your bonus structured quarterly? We just want to make sure you're taking care of your future, honey. You work so hard." I felt a rush of dopamine, a heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the wine. Because for once, they were listening. I told them everything. I described the overtime, the commission structure, the exact amount I had set aside for Leo's education fund and his future. I felt a deep sense of connection, a belief that we were finally a unit. Over dessert, the temperature shifted. Thalassa set her silver fork down with a sigh that carried the weight of the world. Her boutique was struggling with cash flow issues, due to a late shipment. "Just this once, Aurel," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "If I could just borrow $5,000 for the quarterly rent, I'll pay it back by the new year. I promise. I'm just so embarrassed to ask Mom." I felt a surge of pride. I was the one with the power to save her. I pulled out my phone right there at the table. My fingers had a slight tremor as I authorized the transfer, watching my savings balance dip. I told myself it was an investment in my family's happiness. Family helps family, I reasoned. It's a dangerous sentence when you're the only one saying it. But just this once has a way of becoming a metronome. A week later, Zenobia suggested that since I was so much better with logistics, I should just set up a recurring payment for the Sterling Family Trust. It was a fancy name for Thalassa's debts and Zenobia's lifestyle. It happened so quietly I barely noticed the transition from a voluntary gift to a mandatory tax. I stopped seeing the money as my own. I started seeing it as the subscription fee I paid for the right to belong at their table. It was a slow boil. The escalation followed a ladder I was too tired to climb down from. First, it was the rent for Thalassa, $2,500 every month. Then, a second tier was added for the insurance on Zenobia's estate, another $1,200. Then came the emergencies: a broken furnace, a roof leak, a sudden legal fee. Curiously, every time a furnace broke, Thalassa seemed to appear in a new photo wearing a Birkin bag or a limited edition silk wrap. When Leo got sick last year and I had to miss a week of field calls, my income dipped. I mentioned it to Zenobia, hoping for a moment of grace. She simply looked through me and said, "We all have our struggles, Aurel, but the estate depends on your consistency. Your father always said reliability was your only real virtue." She was right about one thing. I was reliable. It's my professional curse. Late at night, in the silence of my apartment, I would open my laptop. I kept a spreadsheet, a habit from my years of investigating fraudulent claims. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, reason. Column D, note. I scrolled to the bottom. I saw the shock number in bold red. In 5 years, I had transferred $420,000 to them. It was the price of a house in a good school district. It was Leo's entire future, bleeding out through 1,000 small cuts. Zenobia called the next morning, her voice bright and brittle. "You're so lucky you're so smart with money, Aurel. Not like poor Thalassa. She's too artistic, too fragile to understand numbers. It's a good thing you're there to carry her. It's what makes you special." It felt like an embrace, but I'm an investigator and I know what it feels like to be strangled. At that moment, I realized I hadn't been forgotten. I had been used against my own interests. I didn't see the red flags because I was too busy using them to stitch the family back together. I had handed them the keys, the ammo, and the map to my own destruction. I was the architect of my own exploitation, building a mansion of lies for people who would leave me in the snow the moment the furnace actually died. I didn't know it yet, but the reckoning was coming. And it wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a severance. December 24th, 4:02 p.m. That was the minute the world I had meticulously built out of duty and silence finally cracked open. I was driving toward the Sterling estate, my mind occupied with the logistics of the evening, when the screech of tires on black ice severed the quiet. Through my windshield, I saw the black Escalade, my mother's car, lurch forward with a violent, purposeful velocity. The mechanism of the crash was a blur of physics. The nose of the heavy SUV shoved the rear of my sedan toward a concrete barrier. I heard the scream of twisting metal, followed by the sound of safety glass disintegrating. 1,000 diamonds hitting the asphalt in a synchronized shatter. Then came the smell. Scorched rubber, hot antifreeze, and the metallic tang of blood. The seatbelt locked against my collarbone with a jolt that forced the air from my lungs. I woke to the rhythmic clicking of a hazard light. My neck felt like it was being held together by rusted wire. In the back, Leo was screaming, a high, thin sound that sliced through the ringing in my ears. I reached back blindly, my fingers brushing his leg, my voice a ragged whisper telling him I was there. It was 4:15 p.m. The temperature was dropping to 20 degrees. The pediatric clinic was 10 miles away and Leo was burning up with a fever of 102. My phone sat in the center console, its screen cracked, showing 4% battery. I had exactly 30 minutes before the sun vanished and the sallow winter dark took over. I didn't ask for money. I didn't ask for comfort. I called Zenobia. "Mom!" I gasped, the words feeling like shards of glass. "There was an accident. The driver... He took my car. Leo is sick, Mom. I'm bleeding. Please, just send someone to get Leo and take him to the clinic. I'll meet you there." The line was quiet for a heartbeat. I could hear the clink of silver in the background. Zenobia didn't gasp. She sighed, a soft, inconvenient sound. "Aurele, the caterers are setting up. I can't have a sick child coughing in the foyer while the director is here. It's bad for the brand. Catch an Uber. Don't ruin this for Thalassa." The line went dead. I stared at the screen as a notification pinged from the family thread. Thalassa had posted a photo of the long mahogany dining table, glowing with candlelight and crystal. Underneath, she typed, "Aurel is always so unlucky when it's her turn to help. Focus on the party, Mom." It was marked. Seen at 4:22 p.m. "Is that your mother?" I looked up. Sarah, an EMT with badge number EMT 4421, was leaning into the car. She had seen the screen. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, but her eyes held a spark of something sharp. Without a word, she pulled out her own device and snapped a photo of my cracked screen. The message, the emoji, the timestamp. "I'm documenting the lack of an emergency contact response for the police report," she said, her voice steady. "You're on your own, honey. Let's get you and the boy to the hospital." The next few hours were a lesson in the smell of procedure, the smell of process. I signed the police accident report, Connecticut, 8829X, my fingers leaving faint red ink marks on the carbon paper. I felt the emergency patient admission bracelet snap onto my wrist. I read the discharge summary: acute neck injury and laceration. Each document was like a brick in the wall I was building, not out of anger, but out of necessity. By 6:30 p.m., I had given up hope for a miracle. I called a private medical escort, someone I knew through work who was always willing to help. I paid $350, 3 times the holiday rate, to have a professional stay with Leo in the pediatric ward while I sat in the hallway. I paid without hesitation. I realized I had the resources to save myself. I was just wasting them on people who wouldn't even bother to send a car to pick up my dying son. The aftermath was 3 days of deafening silence. No calls from the estate. No one checked if Leo's lungs had cleared. Just the quiet hum of the heater in my small apartment and the dull, consistent ache in my neck. I returned to the Sterling estate on the 3rd night to find the medication I had left in the garden shed during the chaos. I didn't go to the front door. I went to the side, huddling against a wind that tasted like salt and iron. That was when I found him again, Vane Halloway. He was leaning against the shed, his skin ashy, his coat thin and worn. I didn't think about the $420,000 I had lost to my family. I didn't think about the whiplash. I took off my only cashmere scarf, the one Thalassa had always admired, and wrapped it around the stranger's neck. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, and for a moment, the silence between us was the only honest thing in Hartford. In that moment, a fundamental truth settled into my bones. Strangers had shown up. My family hadn't. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a convenience. And the minute I stopped being convenient, I ceased to exist. The door to my past hadn't just closed. It had been bolted from the inside. It was 2 a.m. on December 27th when I finally sat down in my kitchen in Hartford. The house was dead quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. The only light in the room was the harsh blue glow reflecting off my laptop screen, carving shadows into the walls. The smell of hospital antiseptic still clung to my skin, a sharp reminder of the sterile hallways I'd just left. When I reached up to adjust my hair, my fingers brushed the yellowing bruise on my neck. The whiplash was settling in, turning a deep, ugly shade of eggplant purple. Beside my laptop sat a stack of Leo's medical bills and a half-empty cup of lukewarm coffee that tasted like burnt beans and exhaustion. My phone buzzed on the granite counter. It was a notification from Zenobia, asking why I hadn't RSVP'd to Thalassa's New Year's Eve Diamond Gala. I stared at the bills, then at the glowing screen. For 15 years I had been the difficult daughter, the one who worked too much and felt too little. But as I looked at the digital trail of my own exploitation, the victim in me stepped aside. The investigator took over. I wasn't an ungrateful child anymore. I was a professional looking at a fraudulent claim. I had 2 options: keep bleeding out until there was nothing left, or stop the hemorrhage. I chose to build. I opened my banking app. I navigated to the Recurring Payments tab, the digital veins that had been feeding the Sterling estate for half a decade. There they were, staring back at me like parasites. $2,500 for Thalassa's luxury loft rent, $1,200 for Zenobia's estate landscaping, $400 for Osric's premium gym membership. My father once told me that the only way to measure a person's true intent is to look at where they put their money when they think no one is watching. My intent had been love. Theirs was a line item. I didn't hesitate. I worked through the list with the cold, rhythmic precision of a surgeon making life-saving incisions. Cancel recurring payment #1. Confirm. Cancel recurring payment #2. Confirm. Disable direct debit. Sterling Family Trust. Confirm. Change password. Enable two-factor authentication. Mute group chat. Sterling Legacy. There was no lightning bolt, no dramatic music, just the soft, mechanical click of a mouse and the sudden, deafening silence of a life being reclaimed. It felt like setting down an old, waterlogged wool coat I'd been wearing in a rainstorm for 10 years. There were no tears, just oxygen. I felt light, not the lightness of joy, but the lightness of a foundation finally cleared of rot. A soft knock came from the side door. It was Vane Holloway. He was holding a thermos of hot tea, his movements steady and quiet. I had opened the guest quarters for him, a small space above the garage that Zenobia usually used for storing seasonal decor. He sat across from me, his eyes studying the bruise on my neck before meeting my gaze. "How are you, Aurelia?" "Really?" he asked. His voice was low, devoid of the hollow pity I usually received from Hartford socialites. I looked at my empty bank queue, the red numbers finally gone. "Better," I said. "For the first time in my life, I've stopped negotiating with people who don't love me. I finally understand that I don't owe anyone an apology for my own survival." Vane set a sealed manila envelope on the table. It was labeled Cyprian David, Evidence Log. He slid it toward me. "Your father didn't just leave you a work ethic, Oral. He left you a trail of breadcrumbs because he knew you were the only one smart enough to follow them." I opened the file. It wasn't just memories, it was a map. I realized then that I had been building a mansion of lies for people who would leave me to freeze the moment the furnace died. I knew the fallout was coming. Zenobia and Thalassa would notice the money was gone long before they ever noticed I was no longer standing at the gates. They didn't love the daughter, they loved the ATM. And I had just turned the lights out on the bank. I thought the silence would be the hardest part of the night. But as I looked at the evidence my father had hidden in plain sight, I realized the truth was about to walk through the front door, and this time, I wouldn't be the one asking for permission to speak. December 28th, 6:15 a.m. I'm in the kitchen of my small apartment, the only sound in the room being the rhythmic scraping of a spoon against a cast-iron pan. I'm making pancakes for Leo. The house smells faintly of maple and cedar leaves, a family peace I've strived to achieve with every penny I've saved. My phone lies face down on the marble countertop, muted. Silence is no longer a punishment. It's more like a choice. But the ache between the ribs was still there, the muscle memory of being the family's caretaker. I caught myself reaching for a third plate before I remembered I was no longer serving a table of 3. It's a hard skin to shed, the habit of anticipating someone else's hunger while ignoring your own. A slight tremor ran across the stone slab. It was Vane Holloway calling from the guest house. His voice was hoarse, a whisper through the loudspeaker. "Aurel, they're here. A black Escalade just turned into the dead end. But before you open the door, you need to see what I'm holding." My heart hit a 90 BPM rhythm instantly. I didn't run, but I moved with the clinical speed of a field investigator heading toward a high-speed collision. I checked the monitor. 8:01 a.m. At 8:04 a.m., 3 sharp rhythmic raps echoed against the heavy oak. I looked through the peephole. Zenobia and Thalassa stood on the porch, draped in morning silk as if they were ready to film a high-budget tragedy. Zenobia's face was set in a mask of practiced grief, her hand already reaching for a handkerchief. Before I could touch the handle, Vane Holloway stepped onto the porch from the side garden. He wasn't the bumbling, ashy stranger I'd found in the shed anymore. He wore a crisp trench coat, his shoulders squared, his posture made of iron. I opened the door just as Vane held up a weathered leather wallet. Inside, pinned to the dark hide, was a federal investigator badge, number 7721DH. The silver caught the gray morning light, cold and unyielding. Vane didn't look at Zenobia. He stared past her at the framed photo on my hallway wall. The portrait of my father, Cyprian. "He was Cyprian David, wasn't he?" Vane asked. The impact was visible. Zenobia's hand flew to her throat, her South Sea pearls rattling against her silk collar. She didn't just look pale. She looked like she'd seen a ghost because, in that second, she had. No one outside of that house knew my father's middle name was David. It was the name he had used for his deep cover work in the bureau. The work Zenobia had spent 10 years claiming never existed so she could collect on a standard civilian life insurance policy. "Aurele, who is this person?" Thalassa squeaked, her voice thin and brittle. Vane didn't answer her. He pulled a vacuum-sealed envelope from his inner pocket and held it out to me. Inside was a yellowed piece of stationery with the Hartford Insurance Company letterhead. It was a letter, signed in my father's heavy, ink-pressed handwriting, dated exactly 3 days before his supposed accident 10 years ago. The subject line was clear. "In event of my disappearance, beneficiary fraud." "This letter," Vane said, his eyes fixed on Zenobia, "states that the accident you reported a decade ago was a dry run." "And the accident 3 days ago? The one where you ordered your driver to ram Aurele's car? That was the final act to collect on a new $5 million policy you took out in her name." Zenobia's lips trembled. She tried to summon the old authority, the voice that used to make me shrink. "This is absurd! This man is a trespasser, Aurele. Tell him to leave." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply pointed to the formal invitations sitting on the console table. The one for the Hartford New Year's Eve Gala, the biggest social event of the season, where Zenobia planned to be honored for her philanthropy. "We aren't discussing this here, Zenobia," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "In 3 days, at the gala, the facts will speak for themselves. I suggest you spend that time finding a very good lawyer. You're going to need one who specializes in federal fraud, not just social optics." I looked at the badge in Vane's hand, then at the woman who had abandoned me in the mud. Someone once said that we are not defined by our scars, but by the hands that heal them. My mother's hands only knew how to push. Vane's hands held the truth. An absolute silence fell over the porch, measured in the 5 seconds it took for Zenobia to realize that the ATM she had relied on for years had finally become a judge. I closed the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was the only answer I had left for them. The rhythmic thrum-thrum of the laser printer filled my small apartment at 11 p.m. A mechanical heartbeat in the silence. The air smelled of hot paper and ozone. Methodically, I slid 12 months of bank statements into clear plastic sleeves, my fingers tracing the direct debit entries to Thalassa's boutique. I highlighted each one in a clinical, unyielding yellow. My hands trembled slightly as I snapped the heavy silver rings of a black leather binder shut. I applied the adhesive tabs with the focus of a surgeon. Financials, medical receipts, police report, numbers CT 8829X, the Cyprian letter. This wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of architecture. I wasn't building a case to win a shouting match. I was building a levee against a 15-year flood of lies. I had learned that when people refuse to hear your voice, you must make them read your receipts. Vane Halloway leaned over my kitchen island, flipping through the tabs. He stopped at the final page, his eyes lingering on the red total at the bottom. $420,000, Aurele, he whispered, the gravity of the number hanging in the air. "And they spent every holiday calling you a burden while they cashed the checks." He slid the binder back to me and gave a singular, slow nod. "Let the paper do the talking tonight. You just breathe." The warning came at 6:15 p.m. the following evening. A text pings from a cousin I hadn't spoken to since my father's memorial. "Aurele, Zenobia told the whole family you've had a complete nervous breakdown since the fender bender. She said you're acting erratic, confused, and making up stories about the estate. Everyone is on high alert." It was the classic move. Discredit the witness before she ever opens her mouth. To the family, I was the sensitive one, the unstable daughter. I gripped my phone until my knuckles turned white, then I let out a long, slow breath. I didn't respond. The truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to be present. By 8 p.m., I was standing at the entrance of the Hartford ballroom. It was a cathedral of old money. Chandeliers that looked like frozen rain, the heavy scent of lilies, and the faint, expensive smell of floor wax. I walked in, my neck brace hidden under a silk scarf, the black binder tucked under my arm like a shield. I could feel the eyes of the Hartford elite shifting toward me, pitying, suspicious. whispering behind gloved hands. Zenobia glided toward me almost instantly, a glass of vintage champagne in her hand. She smiled, but her eyes were shards of ice. "Oh, Aurelie, we weren't sure you'd be well enough to attend. Are you feeling stable, dear? We're all so worried about your state of mind." I didn't flinch. I didn't look for a mother's warmth where none existed. "I'm fine, Mrs. Sterling," I replied. The use of Mrs. instead of Mom caused a visible flicker of panic in her expression. It was the first brick removed from her wall. She turned to a group of board members, her voice rising just enough to be heard. "Poor Aurelie. Since the accident, she's been so confused. The whiplash. The doctors say it's affected her memory. She's been telling the most erratic stories lately." The crowd murmured. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I just stood there, holding my binder like a rudder in a storm, watching the social narrative set its own trap. I caught the eye of the chairman of the board across the room, an old friend of my father's who had always looked at me with a quiet, observant kindness. He saw the binder. He saw the scarf hiding my stitches. He gave me a singular, imperceptible nod, a signal of authority. The chairman tapped his glass with a silver spoon. The room fell into a practiced, expectant silence. He was about to announce the annual Sterling philanthropic contribution. But Zenobia couldn't wait. Driven by the fear of what was in my hand, she stepped onto the dais and literally intercepted the microphone. She looked at the audience, her voice trembling with manufactured grief, her eyes glistening for the cameras. "Before the chairman begins," she said, "there is a painful matter the family must address for the sake of transparency. My daughter, Aurelie, for her own safety and ours. We have to discuss her recent, tragic condition." The room held its breath. I reached into my pocket and hit play on a small remote connected to the ballroom's Bluetooth system, a system I had installed for them years ago when I was still their useful daughter. My binder was open on the table nearest the stage. The trap wasn't just set, it was closing. "Before you say anything else, Zenobia," I said, my voice quiet and cutting through the silence, "perhaps the family should hear what you say when the cameras aren't rolling." The Hartford ballroom was a sea of black ties, shimmering silk, and the oppressive scent of expensive gin. Under the massive crystal chandeliers, which hung like frozen rain from the gilded ceiling, the air hummed with the refined murmur of old money and the rhythmic vibration of a string quartet playing Vivaldi. It was a cathedral of pretense, and Zenobia Sterling stood at its altar. She looked every bit the grieving noble matriarch, her hand resting with practiced maternal grace on Thalassa's shoulder. They were an island of choreographed tragedy, in a room full of people waiting to be inspired by their resilience. Zenobia took the floor, her movements fluid and slow. She didn't just walk to the microphone, she ascended to it. When she spoke, her voice carried a delicate, tragic tremor, a sound designed to bypass logic and strike directly at the heartstrings of the donors. "As many of you know," she began, her gaze sweeping the room with a hollow luminosity, "my youngest, Aurelie, has struggled since the accident. It is a mother's greatest heartbreak to watch a brilliant mind become erratic. We have sacrificed so much to carry her through her breakdown, but tonight, for the sake of the legacy, we must focus on the Sterling Foundation, not the burden of our private trials." I was seated at table 12, near the back. I didn't stand up. I didn't shout, "Liar." I simply held my champagne glass with a steady, clinical grip and watched. The pity in the room was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders as the guests turned to look at me with sympathetic, guarded eyes. I let the silence become my armor. I sat through every word of her indictment, watching the way her pearls caught the light, noting how she used her own daughter's condition as a shield for her own greed. She was effectively hanging herself with a rope of her own polished lies. The atmosphere shifted when Vane Holloway moved toward the audiovisual booth. At that exact moment, the chairman of the board stood up. He was a man of granite and silence, a true friend to my father who had spent 30 years watching the Sterling family from the periphery. He didn't look at Zenobia. He looked directly at me. "Before we raise a toast to sacrifice," the chairman said, his voice cutting through the room like a coal blade, "there is a matter of fiduciary truth that requires a final audit." The large projection screen behind Zenobia flickered to life. It wasn't a family tribute. It was a ledger. The spreadsheet was clinical, devoid of emotion, and devastating in its clarity. Sterling Family Trust outflow, 2020-2025, $420,000. Recipient, Thalassa Sterling Boutique and Private Accounts. Source, R.L. Sterling's Personal Disability and Savings Accounts. The room went ice cold. The sound of shifting silk stopped. I watched the eyes of the donors move from the red numbers on the screen to Zenobia's face. Then came the mic drop document, a PDF of the police accident report, NumCT 8829X, followed by a high-resolution screenshot of the family group chat from Christmas Eve. Arlie is always so unlucky when it's her turn to help. Focus on the party, Mom. The social verdict was instantaneous and wordless. I saw board members physically pull their chairs away from Zenobia and Thalassa. People lowered their glasses. The quartet stopped playing. The chairman read the final line of my father's letter into the silence. If I do not return, my wife has chosen profit over my breath. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open. 2 officers in dress blues entered, their boots clicking sharply against the marble. They weren't there for the hors d'oeuvres. They moved toward the stage with a sense of inevitability that no amount of social standing could block. I stood up then. I walked to the center of the floor, not as a victim, but as the only person in the room who knew the full value of the truth. I didn't look at the police. I looked at Zenobia. Her face was the color of ash, her mask finely split down the center. I didn't come here to embarrass you, Zenobia, I said, my voice low and perfectly even. I came here to stop being a ghost in my own history. You didn't lose a husband 10 years ago, you traded him for a policy. And you didn't have a dramatic daughter. You had an automated bank teller that you tried to decommission when she became inconvenient. I adjusted my silk scarf, feeling the weight of the stitches beneath. I have canceled every recurring payment. I have filed the federal fraud reports. If you wish to be in my life from this moment forward, it will be as a stranger facing the legal consequences of your choices, not as a mother facing her child. That is the boundary, and it is irrevocable. Zenobia began to protest, her voice rising in a high, desperate pitch. But the chairman simply turned his back to adjust his cufflink. The crowd followed his lead, a synchronized withdrawal of attention that left her standing in a vacuum. I set my champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray. The tiny clink of the crystal was the loudest sound in the ballroom. I turned and walked toward the exit, my back straight, my breathing rhythmic and deep. Behind me, the flash of a camera caught Zenobia being escorted out into the falling snow, the same snow she had left me to Quishuang in 3 days ago. I didn't look back. I didn't need to witness her downfall to know that I had finally stood firm. The axis of my world had shifted, and now I was in control. The Hartford ballroom was half empty by the time I walked toward the valet. The music had long since stopped, replaced by a hollow stillness that echoed off the gilded molding. There was no cheering, no grand celebration of victory, just the muffled sound of footsteps on marble and the soft, rhythmic clink of the catering staff clearing away half-full glasses of flat champagne. The air felt lighter than it had in 15 years, but it was a cold lightness, like the atmosphere after a fever finally breaks. Zenobia and Thalassa were gone, ushered into the winter night by the silent machinery of the law. Their absence left a physical void in the room, yet for the first time, their presence didn't dictate the temperature. I watched as the social order of Hartford rearranged itself in real time. People didn't look at me with that suffocating, performative pity anymore. They looked at me with a distance that commanded respect, the kind given to an investigator who finally closed a cold case. When Osric tried to approach a group of investors near the coat check, his voice cracked as he spoke. The chairman of the board simply turned his back to adjust a cufflink, cutting him out of the conversation without a single word. No one needed to pronounce a sentence. The hierarchy had simply collapsed. As I reached the door, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in a decade stopped me. She touched my arm tentatively. "Orla, I didn't know," she whispered, her eyes searching mine. "About the money. About what happened to David." I gave her a singular nod. I didn't offer forgiveness, but I didn't offer an argument either. I simply took my coat and walked into the freezing night. My phone vibrated at 2 a.m. It was a voicemail from Zenobia, likely recorded from a roadside motel. There was no apology in her voice, only the desperate, ragged attempt to reclaim the narrative. How could you humiliate us like that, Aurel? After everything I sacrificed to keep this family together? You've ruined our name for a few bank statements. I listened to it once, sitting in my dark kitchen. I realized she wasn't fighting for a relationship. She was fighting for the version of me she could control, the version that kept her lifestyle afloat. I didn't reply. I didn't send a counter-argument or a list of grievances. I simply swiped left and deleted the message. I blocked their numbers, not out of a need for revenge, but to preserve the silence I had finally earned. 3 months later, March arrived in Hartford. The ice along the Connecticut River was finally melting, revealing the dark, steady current beneath. My life had become small, predictable, and entirely mine. Leo was sleeping through the night, his breathing rhythmic and clear. My work at the investigative firm was steady. I was no longer the daughter who was too busy, but the professional who was indispensable. I still feel a phantom ache in my neck on rainy days, a physical reminder of the night I was a spare tire. I still feel a momentary flash of sadness when I see a family at the park, but it is a sadness born of observation, not regret. I realized then that I didn't need Zenobia's permission to be a Sterling. I didn't need Thalassa's recognition to be the daughter of Cyprian David. I already was. Sitting at my desk one morning, I opened a folder on my laptop labeled Sterling Estate Matters. I looked at the files, the emails, the ledger, the letters. I selected the folder, hit delete, and emptied the trash. The digital space vanished, leaving only a clean gray screen. If you are currently carrying a weight that was never yours to bear, if you are sitting at a table where you have to shrink yourself just to fit in, remember, you are allowed to set it down. You are allowed to walk away and let the silence do the work. I looked out the window at the budding trees along the street. The world didn't end when I stopped being the good girl who paid for everyone else's mistakes. It just finally started turning in the right direction.